How long? I want to know exactly how long.
You are being dramatic. You always do this. You always make something out of nothing.
His name is in your phone 142 times. 142 times, Mama. That is not enough.
Grace, what is this? Lower that phone before I do it for you.
Were you in my house? Were you in my bed? While I was working, while I was trusting both of you.
I said lower the phone.
You just slapped me.
Grace.
And I just slapped you back.
Both of you need to calm down.
You are drinking wine. Your wife and her mother are fighting because of you, and you are standing there drinking wine.
I said calm down. Now look what you have done.
What I have done.
Grace had always believed that the two safest places in the world were her mother's arms and her husband's house. She had built her entire adult life on that belief. She had made every major decision: who to marry, where to live, how much of herself to give, inside the certainty that those two anchors would hold. Her mother had raised her alone after her father died, working as a seamstress in Enugu, taking in alterations and bridal gowns and school uniforms until Grace finished university. Her mother had sacrificed without complaint and without record, and Grace had loved her for it, with the kind of love that does not ask join, the love that simply trusts because trust has never been given a reason to doubt. Kenneth had come into her life at 31. He was 42, established, a property developer with a project portfolio that stretched from Abuja to Port Harcourt. He had a calm about him that Grace had mistaken for steadiness. He was not loud, he did not perform. He simply arrived and stayed and said the right things at the right moment. And Grace, who had been careful about men her entire adult life, found herself lowering a guard she had spent years building. They married after 14 months, a full church wedding in Enugu, followed by a reception at a hotel in GRA that her mother helped plan, from the seating arrangements to the menu. Her mother had cried during the ceremony, the full, unguarded tears of a woman watching her only child settle into safety. Grace had looked across at her from the altar and felt so much love she could barely stand inside it. That was 3 years ago. What Grace did not know, could not have imagined, would not have believed if anyone had told her, was that something had already begun to grow in the dark long before the wedding. She found it by accident, the way most devastating things are found, not through suspicion or investigation, but through an ordinary moment that opens into something it was never supposed to open into. It was a Wednesday in October. She had come home from the school where she taught English to secondary students in Lekki Phase 2, tired in the specific way that teaching tired her. Not physically exhausted, but mentally wrung, every part of her attention spent. Kenneth was away in Abuja for a site inspection. Her mother had come to spend a few days. She did this occasionally, arriving with food she had cooked in Enugu and packed in cooler bags, filling Grace's kitchen with the smells of her childhood. Grace had come in and dropped her bag and kicked off her shoes and gone looking for her mother to say she was home. She found the sitting room empty. She found the kitchen empty. She called out and her mother answered from upstairs, from the bedroom, Grace's bedroom, where she said she had been resting. Grace went upstairs. Her mother was sitting up on the bed looking comfortable and unhurried. They talked for a while about Grace's week, about a neighbor in Enugu whose daughter had just had twins, about nothing important. Then Grace's mother stood to go downstairs and start warming the food she had brought, and Grace sat on the edge of the bed and picked up her phone from the bedside table to check her messages. Except it was not her phone. The case was identical, same brand, same color, a plain black cover Grace had bought from a roadside vendor 6 months ago. But the screen that lit up when she pressed the button was not her screen. The wallpaper was different, the apps were arranged differently, and the message notification that appeared at the top, the one that had come in while the phone sat silent on her bedside table, was from a contact saved as My Heart. Grace sat very still. She told herself she was wrong. She told herself it was her phone and she was confused from tiredness. She told herself there was an explanation that was not the explanation currently assembling itself in her chest like something with weight and edges.
She opened the message. I miss you. When is she going to school? Tomorrow. The contact name was My Heart. The number, Grace knew this number. She had known this number for 31 years. It was the number her mother had carried since mobile phones arrived in Nigeria. It was the number she had memorized before she memorized anything else. It was the number she called when she was sick, when she was scared, when something good happened and she needed to tell someone immediately. She sat on the edge of her bed in the room that smelled of her mother's perfume, the same perfume her mother had worn since Grace was a child, and she read the message 3 times. Then she scrolled up. She stopped scrolling after the first 20 messages because 20 was more than enough. 20 was more than enough to tell her everything she needed to know about the length and the nature and the deliberateness of what had been happening in the dark behind the face of everything she loved. The messages went back 9 months. 9 months of I miss you and I'll come when she's at work and don't worry about her and you know how I feel about you and she doesn't have to know. And the ones that were worse than all of those, the ones where her mother wrote back in her own words, her mother's voice unmistakable even in text, comfortable and warm and completely without guilt. Grace put the phone down on the bed. She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the compound below, the well-kept compound of the house Kenneth had bought and furnished and brought her to as his wife. She looked at the mango tree. She looked at the gate. She looked at the ordinary afternoon light falling on ordinary things. Then she walked downstairs. Her mother was in the kitchen. She had the cooler bags open and was spooning stew into a pot. She looked up when Grace came in and smiled the same smile, the exact same smile Grace had trusted for 31 years. Her mother said, I'm almost done warming. Sit down, you look tired. Grace said, you left your phone upstairs. Her mother's hands stilled on the pot, just for a moment, just long enough. My phone is in my bag. Your bag is here, Grace said. She put the phone on the kitchen counter between them. This one was on my bedside table. The kitchen was very quiet. Her mother turned from the stove slowly. She looked at the phone. She looked at Grace. And Grace watched something happen behind her mother's eyes, a rapid, practiced calculation. The kind that happens when a person who has been managing a secret for a long time suddenly feels the management slipping. Grace, how long? Grace said. You don't understand. How long, Mama? Her mother set down the spoon. She reached for the phone. Grace moved it back. How long?
What followed was not a confession. It was something worse than a confession. It was justification. Her mother's voice shifted into the register she had heard her use when she was explaining a decision she had already made and was not going to unmake. She said Grace did not understand Kenneth. She said Kenneth had problems in the marriage that Grace did not know how to address. She said it had not been her intention.
She said these things had a way of happening. She said Grace was young and would recover. She said she had not stopped loving her daughter. She said all of these things in a voice that remained impossibly calm. Grace stood in her own kitchen and listened to her mother explain why her husband had been appropriate to love. She did not cry. She did not shout. She felt something happen inside her that was not either of those things. Something that was closer to a fundamental structural collapse. The way a building does not always fall dramatically, but sometimes simply settles inward, floor by floor, each level giving way into the one below. She asked her mother to leave. Her mother did not leave. She said they needed to talk. She said Grace was not being reasonable. She said she needed to hear her out. She sat down at the kitchen table with the authority of a woman who had always occupied the most important seat in every room Grace had ever been in, and she began to talk again. Grace went upstairs. She sat in her bedroom until Kenneth came back from Abuja 2 days. She had not spoken to her mother in those 2 days. Her mother had stayed, had cooked, had moved around the house, had knocked on the bedroom door twice and been ignored. Grace had eaten crackers from her bag and drunk water from the bathroom tap and lain on the side of the bed furthest from where her mother's phone had rested. And she had done something she had not done since childhood. She had tried to find the flaw of her own grief and discovered it was further down than she had expected. Kenneth arrived on a Friday evening. Kenneth came in with his bag and his easy manner and his flat calm. And he called out for Grace the way he always did. She came downstairs. She was wearing the same clothes she had put on that morning. Her face was very still. He looked at her. Then he looked at her mother, who was sitting at the dining table with the specific posture of someone who has been waiting for something difficult to begin. He understood immediately that he had been found out. Grace could see it in the single second of recalibration that passed across his face. Before his expression settled back into the flat calm she now understood was not steadiness at all. It was simply blankness, the absence of anything real. "Grace," he said. "Sit down, Kenneth," she said. He sat. What happened over the following hour was the kind of conversation that cannot be planned or prepared for. It simply happens, grinding and terrible, all three people in it saying true things that could never be unsaid. Kenneth confirmed what the messages had shown. He did not apologize, not really. He explained the way her mother had explained, as though explanation were the same as accountability. He said the marriage had been difficult. He said he had not meant for it to happen this way. He said Grace had been distant. He said her mother had understood him in ways Grace had not. Grace listened to her husband explain that her mother understood him better than she did. She sat with that sentence inside her for a long moment. Then she stood up and she said, "Both of you need to leave my house tonight." Her mother stood up from the dining table. "Grace, this is also Kenneth's house." "Kenneth's name is not on the deed," she said. It was not a lie. The property had been bought through a development company and the residential arrangement had been informal. Kenneth had never formalized it. "I want both of you out." That was when her mother's voice changed. It climbed. It became the voice Grace had had in childhood when her mother was at the end of her patience, loud and cutting and accustomed to ending arguments. She said Grace was being childish. She said Grace was throwing away her marriage over something that could be resolved. She said Grace needed to think about what she was doing. She said all the things a woman says when she is trying to manage the fallout of something she caused and does not want to be held responsible for.
Grace walked out of the sitting room. Her mother followed her. The argument moved the way arguments in pain move, from room to room, up the stairs, out onto the back landing that ran along the upper level of the house and looked down over the compound below. The evening had come fully by now. Orange light from the compound lamp fell across the red tiles of the landing. Kenneth had followed at a distance, not to intervene, not to protect anyone, simply to watch from below with the wine he had poured himself the moment the conversation escalated, as though conflict in his household were entertainment he had purchased a comfortable seat for. Grace's mother slapped her. The sound of it cracked across, landing and fell into the compound below. And even Kenneth looked up from his glass. And Grace, who had never in 31 years raised her hand to this woman. Grace, who had swallowed and absorbed and held and forgiven and swallowed again. Grace, who had built her entire understanding of love and safety around this one person. Grace slapped her back. The fight that followed lasted less than a minute, but it was the longest minute of Grace's life. Not because of the physical pain, though there was pain. Her mother's nails catching her arm, her own shoulder hitting the landing rail. The longest part was what she felt underneath the fighting. The grief of fighting someone she had loved so completely. The horror of arriving at a moment she could never take back. The specific anguish of discovering that the person who taught her how to love had not loved her the same way in return. Her mother fractured her wrist and she fell off the landing and into the compound below. Yes, Grace had called the ambulance. She came downstairs and she knelt beside her mother on the compound tiles, and she held her hand and she talked to her steadily until the ambulance arrived, because whatever her mother had done, she was still a woman on the ground in pain, and Grace was not built to walk away from that. Her mother had fractured her wrist. Bruised 2 ribs. Serious but not permanent. The hospital in Lekki admitted her that night. Grace paid the deposit at the front desk. Kenneth stood beside her with his wallet in his pocket. She noticed. She said nothing. She went home alone that night. Kenneth had gone, she did not know where, and discovered she did not particularly want to. The house was empty in the specific way that houses become empty when the people who were filling them have revealed themselves. She walked through each room slowly, the sitting room with the knocked vase, the kitchen with the cooler bags her mother had brought from Enugu still sitting on the counter, still full of food cooked with hands she had held since she was 3 years old. She sat at the kitchen table and she finally cried. Not the managed, careful kind, the full kind, the kind that has been building for days and arrives all at once, without dignity or restraint, taking everything with it. She cried for the marriage. She cried for the mother. She cried for the version of herself that had existed before Wednesday, the woman who had 2 safe places in the world and no reason to question either of them. She cried until she was empty. Then she washed her face, she made tea, she sat at the kitchen table with the tea going cold in front of her, and she began to think clearly for the first time since she had pressed a button on the wrong phone. She called her friend Helen at 11:30 that night. Helen was a lawyer, commercial, not family, but sharp and connected, and the kind of person who knew who to call for anything. Grace told her everything in a single, uninterrupted account. Helen was silent for a long moment when she finished. Then she said, "Don't touch anything in that house. Don't move anything. Don't sign anything. And don't speak to Kenneth without me present." Grace said, "Okay." Helen said, "Are you safe?" Grace looked around the empty kitchen. "Yes," she said. "I think for the first time in 3 years, I am actually safe." She did not sleep that night.
She sat at the kitchen table and she opened the notes app on her phone and she began to write everything she could remember, dates, conversations, things she had seen that had not registered at the time, things she had explained away, things that now rearranged themselves into a pattern so clear she could not understand how she had failed to see it earlier. She wrote until the morning light came through the kitchen window and the cooler bags on the counter were still there and the tea was completely cold. Helen came the following morning with a colleague who handled matrimonial cases, a quiet, unhurried woman named Blessing, who asked Grace precise questions for 90 minutes and wrote everything down in a small notebook and then said, "You have more ground to stand on than you realize." Kenneth came back that afternoon. He had clearly spent time preparing. His manner was carefully composed. His voice was at the register he used when he wanted to appear reasonable. He said they needed to talk. He said they could work through this. He said what had happened with her mother was complicated and he took responsibility for his part, but that Grace needed to understand the full picture before making any decisions. Grace listened to him speak for 4 minutes. Then she said, "My lawyer will contact you." He looked at her for a long moment. Something passed through his flat calm. Not guilt, not remorse, but something closer to the surprise of a man who has underestimated someone for 3 years and is only now beginning to understand the cost of that underestimation. He left without another word. The hospital discharged her mother after 4 days. Grace visited once, on the second day, alone in the afternoon when the ward was quiet. Her mother was propped against pillows with her wrist in a cast, looking smaller than Grace had ever seen her look. The confidence was gone, that specific confidence of a woman who had always controlled every room. What was left underneath it was something Grace recognized distantly as the face her mother had worn in the years after her father died, when survival was the only agenda. They sat in silence for a while. Then her mother said, "I am sorry, Grace." Grace looked at her. She looked at the cast on her wrist and the bruising visible at the edge of her collarbone and the eyes that were her own eyes in an older face. "I know," Grace said. "I don't know how to explain it," her mother said. "You don't need to explain it today," Grace said. "I am not ready to hear it today." She stayed for 20 more minutes. She made sure the nurses had what they needed. She paid the outstanding balance on the bill because her mother's income from the tailoring had never included a hospital fund. She did these things not because they erased anything, but because she had learned in the 4 days since the landing, the fall, the wine glass, the wrong phone, that love and betrayal were not opposites. They could exist in the same person at the same time. That understanding did not make the betrayal smaller. It simply made it more human and therefore more difficult to set down cleanly. She set it down anyway. Not completely, not yet, but she began. The legal process moved with the particular slowness of things that matter. Blessing filed the petition in November. Kenneth's lawyers responded in December. There were documents and counter-documents and evaluation of assets that revealed, with the unhurried precision of financial disclosure, that Kenneth's property portfolio was considerably larger than Grace had known. She had known he was established. She had not known the full extent of what established meant in numbers. The disclosure surprised her. Her lawyer was not surprised. Blessing had asked the right questions early and had already anticipated the shape of what would emerge. Grace continued teaching. She showed up every morning to her students in Lekki Phase 2, and she taught English literature with the same attention she had always brought to it, perhaps more, because in the classroom, nothing was complicated by love. The text was the text, the students needed what they needed, the work was clear. Her colleagues noticed she was thinner. Her closest colleague, a woman named Bisa Amaka, who taught mathematics and had been Grace's lunch companion for 2 years, asked once if she was all right, and Grace said honestly, "I am getting there." Amaka nodded and did not ask again, and this small act of respectful restraint was one of the kindest things anyone did for Grace in those months.
December brought the first round of settlement negotiations. They happened in Blessing's office on a Tuesday morning, all 4 lawyers present, Kenneth on one side of the table and Grace on the other. Grace wore a plain navy dress and flat shoes. She had pulled her hair back simply. She had not tried to look any particular way, except present, fully, quietly present in her own life, which was more than she had managed for the most of the past 3 years. Kenneth looked at her across the table with the flat calm she now read clearly for what it was. Not steadiness, but the performance of steadiness by a man who had nothing underneath it. He had lost weight too. His lawyer did the talking, so did Blessing. Grace and Kenneth sat across from each other and listened, and occasionally initial documents passed in front of them. At one point, their eyes met. Grace looked at him steadily for a moment. Then she looked back at Blessing. She felt nothing dramatic. That was the most honest thing she could say about it. The man across the table had betrayed her with her own mother, had sat in his compound with a wine glass while 2 women destroyed each other above him, had called it Grace's fault with his first breath after the fall. Whatever she had felt for him, and she had felt real things, she was certain of that, had not survived the weight of what he actually was. What was left was simply the work of separating what had been joined and doing it cleanly. The settlement was reached in February. The house, never formally Kenneth's, its informal arrangement now clearly documented by Blessing's team, remained available to Grace for the remainder of the lease. A financial settlement that reflected Kenneth's disclosed assets was agreed. It was not everything Grace deserved, settlements never are, but it was substantial, and it was clean, and it was done. On the day the papers were signed, Grace drove to the school and taught her afternoon class and came home and cooked herself a meal. Plain rice, simple stew, the kind of food her mother had always made when money was tight and comfort was the most important ingredient. She ate at the kitchen table where she had cried and where she had written her notes through the night and where she had drunk cold tea and begun the long work of understanding what had happened to her. She called Sandra, a friend from university who had been checking on her weekly since October, and told her it was done. Sandra said they needed to celebrate. Grace said not yet. Sandra said whenever you are ready. Grace said yes, whenever I am ready. Her mother had returned to Enugu in January. They had spoken 4 times on the phone, short, careful conversations that contained more silence than words. The silence was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who had broken something between them and were standing on either side of it, not yet knowing whether it could be repaired and not yet ready to find out. Grace's counselor, a woman she had begun to see in November, who had an office in Victoria Island and a manner of listening that made Grace feel heard without being managed, said that the relationship with her mother was a separate question from everything else. She said Grace did not have to answer it on anyone else's timeline. Grace said she knew. She was beginning to know a great many things on her own timeline. March came and the school prepared for second-term examinations, and Gracie's students were anxious, and she helped them prepare with the full attention she had always given the work. One of her students, a quiet girl in the 3rd row, who reminded Grace of herself at that age, stayed after class one afternoon and asked Grace how she knew when she was good enough at something. Grace thought about it honestly. You don't always know. Sometimes you just keep going and the knowing catches up later. The girl nodded as though this made sense. Grace hoped it did. In April, she visited her mother in Enugu. She drove herself, 8 hours on the expressway with stops, the road familiar in the way that childhood roads are always familiar, carrying the memory of every time you have traveled them before. She arrived in the evening. Her mother opened the door and they looked at each other across the threshold for a long moment. Her mother looked older. The months had done something to her that Grace recognized as consequence, not punishment, but the natural weight of actions taken, settling permanently into the face of the person who took them. She had lost the loud confidence. She had not yet found what would replace it. They sat in the sitting room where Grace had grown up. The same worn sofa, the same curtains her mother had sewn herself 15 years ago, the same small table where Grace had done homework while her mother worked on alterations. The next room, the sound of the sewing machine running steady and constant through every evening of her childhood. Her mother said, "I don't expect you to forgive me." Grace said, "I know." "I don't deserve it," her mother said. "No, not yet." Her mother was quiet. "But you are still my mother," Grace said. "That part I cannot change, and I have stopped trying to." They did not resolve everything that evening. Some things cannot be resolved in a single visit or a single conversation or even a single year. What they did was sit together in the room where Grace had been raised and eat the food her mother had cooked, and speak carefully and listen carefully and begin the long, uncertain work of two people, deciding whether what remains between them is enough to build something new on. Grace drove back to Lagos the next morning. She stopped at 9th Mile for suya, wrapped in newspaper, the way she had always eaten it on road trips as a child. And she ate it standing beside her car in the morning air. And she felt something that was not happiness exactly, but was the direction of happiness, the sense of moving towards something rather than simply away. She was back at school on Monday. Her students were preparing for exams. The quiet girl in the third row had done well on her practice paper, and Grace marked it with a red tick and a note in the margin. "Excellent, you knew more than you thought." In June, Grace applied for a deputy head position at a larger secondary school in Ikoyi that had advertised in April. She had seen the advert and set it aside and come back to it 3 times before she applied. Blessing, who had become something closer to a friend than a lawyer by that point, said, "Why did you wait so long to apply?" Grace said, "I wasn't sure I was ready." Blessing said, "You have been ready. You just needed to believe it." She was called for an interview in July. She prepared carefully, not frantically, but with the same precision she had brought to everything since October. The precision of a woman who had learned at great cost what happens when you stop paying attention to the details of your own life. The interview lasted 40 minutes. On the way home, she stopped at the small suya spot near the school and bought herself a wrap and ate it in the car with the window down and the Lagos evening coming in warm and loud and indifferent and alive. She got the job. She started in September. On the first day, she walked into the school building in Ikoyi in a plain grey dress and low heels, and she stood at the window of her new office, small, practical, looking out over a compound where students were arriving for assembly, and she was quiet for a moment. She had been raised by a woman who had betrayed her. She had been married to a man who had watched her fall apart from a comfortable chair with a wine glass in his hand. She had fought on a landing and heard a sound she would never forget, and signed papers in a room that smelled of air conditioning and legal formality, and walked out of a marriage through a door she had not imagined opening. She was 34 years old. She had a new office. She had students who needed what she knew how to give. She had a counselor who listened, and a friend who checked in weekly, and a lawyer who had become something more. She had herself, clearly, finally, without the noise of other people's needs drowning it out. She had herself. She turned from the window. She sat at her desk. She opened the first file. She began. Before you go, tell us honestly, when your own mother is the one who betrays you, do you cut her off completely, or do you find a way back? There is no right answer. Drop your comment below. We want to hear you. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs it today. And drop a comment. We want to hear you. God bless you.